I would just briefly say the title of the session is Institutions and Development. So we will talk how these new institutions which were now established, like amalgamated from others, and the rules that apply to relations between different levels of government, the state government, regional government, local self-governments, how they may be used for better development, or what obstacles they may create if they are not the right ones. We have 5 really interesting speakers for this session. I will briefly introduce them, and then each of them was invited to speak for about 10 minutes to leave enough time also for your questions and maybe my questions or discussion between the members of the session. So our first speaker will be Professor Reto Steiner, who is from Switzerland, and he will tell us about the hope, what we can hope the municipalities and the decentralization and the local self-government may bring good to everyone's life. Because as you know, Switzerland is a very good example of this, and Professor Steiner has spent a lot of time researching different effects of decentralization, not only necessarily the good ones, also sometimes the not so good ones. Then we have 3 speakers, a block of 3 speakers who will speak about the quality of services provided to people by local administrations and local governments. The first one in this block of 3 speakers will be Dr. Gregor Virant. He is, some of you may know him because he led the project for public administration reform in Ukraine for quite a long time. Since then, he did it so well that now he's director of SIGMA, which is the OECD Center for Public Administration Reform. So he will speak from his experience in Ukraine, with some impressions how to improve the public administration also at the local level. Then we have an Ukrainian speaker, Mr. Viktor Tymoshchchuk, who works for both ULIT and ZHAW, has worked a lot and is still working on these administrative service centers, which are, a way to make better services for citizens. But he will speak also more broadly, about the experience from the ground, so to say, what can work, what municipalities. So what they are, they should be allowed to do, but maybe they are not. So then we have the final speaker in this block about the quality of administrative services, Professor Wolfgang Drechsler, who is obviously German from his name, but he works at the technology university in Estonia. And, he will speak about the digitalized administrations and how digitalization can improve the services with, I think, a very fascinating and very lively presentation as well. And finally, after we discuss this block, we have our final speaker, Dr. Natalia Shapoval, who is from Kyiv School of Economics. She will speak about this very important topic, which may be the biggest obstacle to benefits of decentralization, which are the unclear competencies and not clearly defined relations between different levels of government, the state, the regions, the local governments, how this may lead to some conflicts with some examples, and then of course we will talk how to do it better in future. Okay, so let us just start. I would invite Professor Steiner to present his presentation, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. All of us live in a municipality, and we all have an expectation from our municipality what our municipality shall perform and how it shall perform its duties. This is exactly the question we ask citizens from all over Europe, colleagues from different universities. And you see on the next slide the result of this survey. What did the citizens say? They said they expect that municipalities shall solve the problems of the people, the citizens in the respective municipality. Next slide, please. And they also say the services provided by the citizens, by the municipalities, shall be tailored to the needs of the citizens. These have been all over Europe the most answered responses of the citizens of what they expect from the municipality. At a further distance, we see results like services should be cheap, or we need a certain organizational form, or we only need very few services at the local level. All answers concerning the organizational structures and processes seem to be to a less extent important to the citizens than the question: municipalities shall provide services which help to resolve the needs of the citizens. You may now say, this result is not surprising. And it is right. It's self-evident that we all expect from the government that they provide services we need. But the question is, what organizational structure helps to resolve the requests of the citizens? I would like to give you in the next 10 minutes a short introduction into the question, what kind of organizational form may be the best fit one to really answer the questions the citizens have and the expectations they have. Next slide, please. We could do this by using the European Charter of Local Self-Government. I'm a member of the Commission doing the local election monitoring and also the monitoring of how local autonomy is being organized in the member countries of the Council of Europe. The Charter, which has been in force since 1988 and in the Ukraine since 1998, could give us an easy answer, telling whenever possible, municipalities shall provide services, and whenever possible, services shall be provided as close to the citizens as possible, and the citizens shall be able to decide what services they want or not. This charter would be an answer telling us municipalities shall perform public services whenever possible. But I think it is not enough just to cite such articles. We must have a closer look on how the different countries really organize their municipalities and why they have decided to do it in a decentralized way. And an interesting way to do this is having a closer look at Switzerland. Why Switzerland? 2 years ago, a number of scientists, among them and myself, tried to calculate a local autonomy index in Europe. We wanted to see in what country the decentralization has gone furthest. And the results of this study show that Switzerland is the country with the highest degree of decentralization. And therefore it makes a sense to have a closer look and answer the question, why did Switzerland decide to be that decentralized? And what are the consequences of this decentralization? And may there be some suggestions other countries could use as a good example? I know it's never possible to transfer the decisions of one country to another country. But what is possible is the learning, the benchmarking, the bench learning, which helps to make the institution in individual countries stronger. Next slide, please. Switzerland, the most decentralized country in Europe. Therefore, we may think, okay, we will probably have quite large municipalities. And few ones which are really strong. But it's interesting to see that this is not the case. We have more than 2,200 municipalities in Switzerland, a country with 8 million residents only. Therefore, we have very small municipalities. Switzerland is the country with the smallest municipalities in Europe. The median is 1,400 inhabitants only. But these small municipalities perform about 1/3 of all public services in Switzerland. 1/3 of all expenses, of all public expenses, are being spent at the local level. And 1/3 of all income, all tax revenues, is being generated at the local level. So we have small local units, but they are really strong. These local units have seen problems like in most European countries in the last 10-20 years. Tasks have become more complex, and we see new technologies arising, like the digital transformation we see right now spreading all over Europe. And we have citizens who have higher and higher expectations from their municipalities. They expect that the municipalities are responsive and they really provide the services the citizens want. And if not, the citizens raise their voices and they say loudly what they expect. So we have small municipalities, strong ones, but at the same time, municipalities which are under a quite strong pressure. Next slide, please. So it's interesting to answer the question, what may be the success factor so far of these small but strong municipalities, which are still able to cope with these challenges arising in the present. The graph you see here may give an answer. The Swiss municipalities build very strongly upon the ideas of the European Charter of Self-Government. The first thing, and this is the pillar of this house, is that the municipalities have their own resources, they can raise taxes, and in case the municipalities are poor, they get transferred money from the subordinate tiers of government. And at the same time, they have room of maneuver. They can act, but they are also responsible for what they do. This is the strong pillar of each municipality in Switzerland. Built upon this pillar, above this fundament, is that the municipalities all have a very high input legitimacy. All public services have to be approved by the citizens. The citizens come together to the ballot, or they even gather in an assembly to decide on what services they want in what quality. Not the details, but the basics of each service is being decided upon such democratic mechanisms. And then, last but not least, the municipalities are responsible for the way they provide the public services. The subordinate tiers of government give some directions, but the way the service is being provided has to be decided and being done by the municipality. And this together gives a well-run municipality. This system, which very much follows the European Charter of Local Self-Governance and also follows the idea by the German political scientist Virant, what is good governance, is the construction of all Swiss municipalities. Next slide, please. This structuring of the municipalities shows results of what we in Switzerland have experienced with decentralization. And many empirical studies show that the advantages are much higher than the disadvantages. But the disadvantages have not to be neglected, and that they have to be taken care of. The advantages are that services are much closer to the needs of the citizens in the different regions of Switzerland. They are also much more supported by the citizens, and they help to mitigate local conflicts. On the other side, the risk is that inequalities can arise and that sometimes things go slower. If a national government hopes that some services are being introduced and it takes the approval of all municipalities that they provide this service, it can take a little bit longer. But when it is being decided, then there is a strong support for such services. And inequalities have to be taken care of by perequation systems, that poor municipalities get enough funding that they can perform services even in poorer regions. I come to the first conclusions, and this is the last slide. Next slide, and last slide, please.
Thank you.
What are the recommendations? The recommendations from the Swiss experience and also from my experience monitoring municipalities all over Europe through my role in the Council of Europe is we need strong administrative structure. The subsidiarity principle should be recognized. If possible, provide service at the local level. If possible, include the private sector. And you need a strong perequation system to support the poorer municipalities. Second, we need institutional protection mechanisms. Transparency is a conditio sine qua non, is a prerequisite that citizens can make decisions based upon facts. And we need a capacity building that municipalities get support in how they can have a good management system, and that so that they learn how to provide service in a good way. And we need also a system that debts and expenditures are under control. Municipalities shall have the right to decide upon their money, but there shall be rules that the debts don't get too high. Third point, tasks should always be under a permanent scrutiny. Municipalities, local councils should, this is the experience I have seen in Switzerland. I also was a member of parliament and president of the local city parliament, that there should be a regular examination of, is this task necessary? Do we reach the goals we want to reach with this task? And is there a financial feasibility? Can we finance it? And are we financially strong enough to finance this task? And fourth and last point, we need a participation of the citizens. If citizens can really decide upon the services, in general, if they can decide upon the budget of the municipality, they have a stronger sense of responsibility, and there is a higher accountability of the local politicians upon delivering the services the citizens expect. This needs a high financial autonomy of the municipality. Empirical evidence from European countries show if there is a low financial autonomy, then there is also a lower responsibility of the citizens. So we have to strengthen the voice of the citizens, but also to make them accountable of how they get revenues and on how they spend the money. These are 4 pillars, 4 points. I have experience in Switzerland from empirical studies and from own political experience, but also from our monitoring missions, what makes municipalities strong, that they can really deliver services where the citizens say, yes, this is a municipality I'm proud of. This is a municipality which delivers services which help to make life of us better in the place where I live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Steiner. We are just on time to go on without any questions. I would just, by one sentence, underline for the audience your message at the end about direct democracy, which translated to countries without direct democracy, it means there's a lot people can do by themselves and should feel, entitled to do by themselves in order to make their governments work better. But now let's move on. Let's move on now to.
If I can say one sentence, Mr. Chairman, one sentence. Yes, not every country has direct democracy, but there are ways like participatory budgeting or engaging citizens in the planning of urban projects where you can have a form of participation. I think the most important thing is a certain form fitting to the country's needs of citizen engagement.
Thank you very much. Let us go on with our next speaker, Mr. Virant, formerly from Ukraine, but now from OECD Sigma. Please, Gregor.
Thank you, Yanis. I have to make a disclaimer at the outset. I'm not an expert in decentralization. I am an expert in public administration reform, and this is what I was doing in Ukraine, and this is what my current position is about. However, if there is one thing I would like you to remember from my presentation today is that there is a very strong connection between public administration reform and decentralization reform in Ukraine or in any other country. They are just two sides of the same coin, I would say. I don't know if you can see my slides. Even if you don't, it's not a problem, because they're nothing special. I will simply talk about what I wanted to say. Public administration reform in Ukraine is in progress. It started several years ago. And it is about the following issues. It's about the reform of the civil service and HRM, mainly aiming at creating a more professional civil service and a merit-based one. Not very successful so far, I would say. Then it's about digitalization and improvement of the quality of services that public administration delivers to the citizens and to businesses. I would say that this segment of PAR in Ukraine has been the most successful so far. Many successful stories, such as the interoperability framework called Trembita, which enables exchange of data between different registries. There is a new electronic services portal called DIA. There is also a fruit of the decentralization reform, which is reflected in I would say, improvements of public administration. These are the centers of administrative service delivery, so-called SNAPs, very successful, and some very, very effective services organized around life events such as Yemaliatko or eBaby, maybe the most prominent one. The reform is also about codifying safeguards of administrative procedure. There is an ongoing discussion in the Rada about the the first ever law on administrative procedure for Ukraine. It is also about strategic planning and policy making of the government, which reflects in the rules of procedure and so on. It's about the organization, restructuring of ministries and agencies, and there is also a separate strategy for the public financial management. On the next slide, you can see what is actually the framework for public administration reform in Ukraine. The value framework are the principles of public administration. It is a framework of standards, also a measurement and monitoring framework that has been developed by the program I'm currently heading. If you want an answer to the question, what is good public administration or what is good governance, one of the possibilities is to take a look in the principles of administration that we have developed. There are all standards, indicators, and very comprehensive measurement framework as well. We have performed a baseline assessment against the principles in 2018. So the state of play of public administration in Ukraine was assessed very thoroughly in 2018. There is a strategy which creates a framework for the reform, the public administration reform strategy. It expires this year, so a new one has already been in preparation. There is a separate PFM strategy, and there is an institutional framework for coordination of public administration reform, led by the Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers and supported by the Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. And now to the point. Where is the cross-section between public administration reform and decentralization? It's on the next slide. There are many issues where PAR meets decentralization. And these issues are mainly the structure of multi-level governance. So the territorial units that are established and organized in the country for the purpose of both decentralization and deconcentration of state functions. The vertical distribution of responsibility between these levels is extremely important. And here we are talking about two things which at the first glance appear to be similar, but they are not exactly the same. One aspect of the distribution of responsibility is decentralization. This is the political aspect. How the responsibilities for policy making in different areas are distributed between different levels of government. Public policy making, managing of public finance, public funds, managing of public infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, and so on and so forth. And there is another process, which we usually call deconcentration, which is more about how the functions and services of the central government, so the ones that have to be centrally owned, state-owned, are organized in the territory. For example, issuing of passports or ID cards, or police control, or inspection control, or fiscal service, and so on and so forth. Now, there is one more connection between the two I would like to mention, namely the standards, the values of good governance that apply to the central government can, mutatis mutandis, or even in exactly the same way, apply also to the subnational government levels. For example, merit-based recruitment, or inclusive policymaking, evidence-based policymaking, public participation in policymaking, value for money, public procurement, and so on and so forth. All the standards that apply to ministries, to the central government, in a way, well, mutatis mutandis, or exactly in the same way, apply also to the regional and local governments. One of the key issues that will have to be answered, will have to be addressed in Ukraine soon, and unfortunately have not yet been comprehensively addressed. That's the previous slide, actually, the previous one. And then we will see the last one, is how to organize deconcentrated, how to deconcentrate the central government functions. So how to organize the central government functions and services across the territory of the country. If we look at the practices of the EU member states and, well, other European countries, but also the OECD member states, we can see that there are several approaches. What the central government can do is organize territorial branches of central public administration bodies, the police, the state tax authority, the central inspection services, and so on and so forth, the Home Affairs Department, the registry, the population registry, can organize their territorial branches on the territory of the country. With very weak horizontal coordination. So there is a very strong vertical line between the central and deconcentrated branches, but there is very weak horizontal coordination. The second possibility is to establish, to organize general territorial public administration bodies with very strong coordination. And the most famous example of it are the French prefectures. So the central government, deconcentrated central government organizations, which are organized at the level of département, at the level of which is equal to the local government level. These services are very strongly coordinated because there is one position which coordinates and leads all these services. So there is a head of prefecture, it's the préfet, and the préfet is a civil servant appointed by the state, by the government, by the Minister of Interior or by the Prime Minister. And there is a third possibility to delegate the functions of the central government to subnational administrations, to local and regional administrations. So the central government says, well, why should we bother to organize our own network of services, of branches, which can just delegate the functions to the existing administrative structures of at the regional and local level. Of course, provide them also with the resources to do that, and that's it. And of course, there is also a possibility to combine these three models. And the last slide, and of course, I have to emphasize that this is all very simplified. Of course, in reality, it is much more complicated and much more sophisticated, and one would need much more time to explain it. But I would just like to draw the attention of the policymakers and of the experts to this very important issue that has not yet been properly addressed. How to do that in Ukraine? Just a couple of quick recommendations for, as a teaser. I think that if you want to have it simple and transparent, you should use the same territorial structure for both decentralization and deconcentration, which in practice would mean the oblast, the rayon, and the hromada level. There should be a clear vertical division of political or policy responsibilities in the framework of decentralization. It should be very clear who does what in education, who does what in healthcare, who does what in roads, road infrastructure, and so on and so forth. There should be a clear distinction between decentralized functions and deconcentrated, because the latter ones should be much more thoroughly controlled and coordinated by the state. So the state functions, including state-owned services, should be centrally coordinated, monitored, and controlled. And here I would like to emphasize that I think it is particularly important that the key registries of the state, such as the registry of population, the registry of the business registry, the registry of legal entities, the registry of lands and real estate, they should all be centralized and centrally owned. Because if they are managed, if they are organized and managed by subnational levels, it can become very, very complicated when it comes to delivering services that depend on the data from those registries. And the very last question, Would it be better for Ukraine to have a monistic or a dualistic system? So to have at the same territorial level, on the one side, self-government, and on the other side, territorial branches of the central government? Or would it be better that the regional and local administrations provide both types of functions? The one type of function in a more autonomous way, the other part of functions in a more controlled way? Well, I leave it open. I leave it to you. Both is possible, and this is just you can use it as as food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Virant. I think we'll come back to a lot of these questions. Other speakers will come back to a lot of these questions. So thank you very much, but let's just go on. I think already Mr. Tymoshchuk will maybe have some additional information and additional views on this division and the responsibilities of local governments. Please, Mr. Tymoshchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Janusz, and thank you, Gregor, for his previous presentation, because it seems to me now we have an opportunity to bridge the things that I'm going to say with what has just been said, because the majority of my messages are going to address the Ukrainian audience, because I have taken very specific questions for discussion. Nevertheless, there will be some general trends that we can also identify both for Ukrainian and international experts. Likewise, would you please bring my presentation on the screen? I would like to talk about the distribution of powers to deliver essential administrative services in the context of decentralization, because as Gregor said, these powers may be shared by one part of the public administration or by another part of public administration, so we have to understand how to use them more appropriately. In the first slide, I would like to make two caveats, because in our panel we have experts presented with various experiences coming from various countries, and this definitely impacts our vision. And these warnings or caveats are as follows. Ukraine is a very large country with large area, but population is 40 million. And the experience of smaller countries, where we only have a population as much as 1 million to 10 million people, proves the point that that experience of such countries in Ukraine works in a very limited way. We borrow the best practices, but still we have to account for that. Therefore, there is the second warning I make. When we talk about the service provision, a very simple recipe is provided. Let us digitalize everything, and then we will resolve all of the problems in this area. And I would immediately like to put an emphasis by saying that in Ukraine, because of the above-mentioned reasons, the large territory and the big population, and many other sub-reasons, the digitalization in short and mid-term, unfortunately, will give only very limited results. And long-term perspective will definitely lies ahead of us, but we still have to think about some other tools in service provision area. And my 20-something-year-long experience bears witness to the fact that the Ukrainian recipe is to trust as much as we can in local governments. And the second point that I make is something that our international experts taught us for many years, that there are many approaches to take as for the principle of good governance, the principle of power distribution. Services have to be delivered as close to people as they can be, and we have heard it today from our speakers. Therefore, they have to be delegated to territorial communities as much as we can. And the state will leave with itself the functions of shaping policies at the level of ministries, something that we have already heard, administering central registries, because this is a very effective tool, especially when we delegate authorities. We shouldn't decentralize running registries. Then there are also functions to help local governments, and another important function is the legal professional oversight over how local governments exercise their mandates. That's something that governmental agencies have to take care of. And let me give you two examples of some successful and not successful experience of delegating authorities. The first successful experience is the years 2015 through 2016, when Mr. Groisman was the prime minister in Ukraine. Two groups of powers were delegated to local governments. This was to do with registering of different businesses, running different registries of property and places of residence. Because we need, once again, to bring these services very close to the citizens. And a lot of corruption was cut out because local self-governments immediately decreased the number of officials that were needed, and people don't have to line up now for different documents and certificates. And when we were organizing the work for administrative service centers, when we were cooperating with ULEAD, we saw that all of these things can also very well go into the purview of ASCs, because they can integrate these activities in a much better way. But we also suffered a very bad failed experience with the same centers, because some took it even further. We listened to our Georgian counterparts, and they suggested that we should implement elements of competition. And when we spoke about the functions of registering businesses, this was something that was given to accredited companies. They are commercial enterprises, and 3 years later we had to reject this practice because there were a lot of violations of law, raidership practices that we call that in Ukraine. And there were very simple reasons for that, because Ukraine unfortunately has a very weak judicial system, justice system. We still have very high levels of corruption, and that means that not all toolkit of public tool management can be applied in Ukraine. And now we seem to be at the peak of decentralization, when territorial prerequisites have been shaped, and there are some conflicts in the redistribution of powers that can be witnessed. First of all, we talk about the registration of birth, death, and marriage. In Ukraine, it's a paradoxical situation at the moment. In large cities, these powers was always the competence of the Ministry of Justice, and the small village communities always had these powers. And now when small villages join towns and cities, they lose their management, and this is a paradox of decentralization reform, when unfortunately services deteriorate for a lot of citizens, when some people in the village areas have to go all the way to 20 or 30 kilometers to a body of the Ministry of Justice to register deaths or births. And towns are hoping to receive this mandate in order to receive, once again, the opportunity to provide these services in their amalgamated communities, but unfortunately now the legislation is lagging behind. And another area where the situation is stark opposite. It's the social security services. When we talk about utility benefits and social benefits, in Ukraine, these are terribly wanted. These services are wanted much. And why is this an opposite situation? Because these authorities and powers and still remain with big towns and cities, something that we call the towns of regional significance. But local, rural communities didn't used to have these powers. And now, logically speaking, decentralization ensures for all amalgamated communities to have a broader mandate. So that means that all communities would have to share all of these powers equally. But the government is right now implementing another kind of policy. First, there will be established a new state-owned body, and perhaps even towns will be deprived of this mandate, and the local governments will only be left with the function of front offices, only receiving documents. And honestly speaking, as a professional, as an expert, I believe this is a decision that still requires a lot of thorough thinking, because once again, as I say, this is paradoxical for decentralization, because after amalgamation, local communities will be losing their powers. Two more areas, I will be very brief. Because in the general context, in this model of decentralization, it's important to mention the property of business registration, as I mentioned that before. Now in Ukraine, they're discussing an option to reject the government control. So they want only judicial control to be exercised at the public level. It's only a draft law, but once again, I think it requires a lot of thinking, because when delegating authorities, it's wrong to refuse administrative oversight for the state. And another illustration I'd like to give, because in Ukraine we are going to open a land market, and land registration as an administrative service is also much in demand. And unfortunately, again, it's an open question for us who will register, who will exercise the registration function, and they would like to give it to some certified, accredited companies. And I believe this is pretty much like that negative experience of the years 2016 and 19, when the similar thing was done with the real estate and business registration. And I would like to appeal with our administrative authorities to be more thoughtful and to pass these authorities to the local self-governments, because they will be most motivated to provide high-quality services. So these are the 4 examples in the area of administrative service provision that bear witness to the fact that we don't have one single analytical approach how to approach the majority of services in demand. And not last but one, I have to mention money, because in November a law was passed into effect which speaks about every hromad, every community, it has to have its own ASC. And we have heard about these ASCs being a very successful example of decentralization in Ukraine. More than 500 amalgamated communities have already created these burger bureaus, as in Germany, or administrative service centers. Nobody forced it onto them, but just because of the help of the public budget and donor support, for 550 amalgamated communities have already set up these centers or are in the process of setting them up. But because the decentralization reform is still going on, the decision was taken that such ASCs have to be present in all amalgamated communities, in all hromadas, because it's an instrument of comfortable and accessible service provision. But unfortunately, in the state budget, there's very little funding in order to ensure that this infrastructure of manpower and premises are ensured. Funding is unfortunately short. Ukrainian experts know about that, but maybe foreign experts will also speak in favor of their experience. If we do not provide direct resources and budgeting, maybe it's a good idea for hromadas to be provided with a fishing rod to ensure relevant compensation for service provision, that is, rational administrative fees. For instance, when they delivered the function of registering real estate facilities, the money from that, the revenue from that, was immediately channeled to the local budget. So I believe that right now we have to reconsider the fees charged for service provision. A lot of them, unfortunately, are very low, or everything is free of charge for the majority of cases. We are not a very rich country, and free of charge, it means that all taxpayers have to pay for that, but not the users of these services. Therefore, I would like to urge the Ukrainian authorities to look at this problem. Maybe we would have to take a special law on administrative fees and charges. And general conclusions to make. We as the state need to have a single strategy and a holistic framework for power distribution that has to be in place, and it has to be applicable to different systems, and we have to be fully aware of how that functions. Second, and most important, we need to delegate certain services and powers to local self-governments in order to motivate them. It's a very powerful mechanism and has demonstrated itself in a very good way in terms of service provision. And 2 more things. to say that in Ukraine, a new law on local self-government is being devised, but they're still not planning to identify the delegated authorities, only their own authorities, the central authorities' mandate. And I don't think it's the best decision, because a lot of newly created communities are still trying to understand what their competencies are, and they will get lost in hundreds of documents to understand what their competencies are all about. So I think that policymakers definitely have to understand the list of their powers and authorities vested in them. And lastly, if the concept of delegating authorities to the local governments is approved as our strategy in order to ensure the development of local municipalities or hromadas, it doesn't mean that all powers have to be delegated within 1 month or 2 months. It has to be a flexible, medium-term strategy, a very differentiated approach when some more capable communities can undertake these powers now. Others will have to start doing this at a later stage. But in this way, I think that we would be pursuing and targeting the correct purpose in correct way.
I would just ask everyone who is in this room of speakers to mute your microphones on the screen while others are speaking, because otherwise we are getting some echo. I forgot to do it myself as well, so that's why I dare to assume that maybe some of you forgot about this too. We need to go right on with the speakers, and we'll just go on with all the speakers, and then if there's time, we will have some questions and discussions at the end. So the next speaker is Wolfgang Drechsler. This will be now something different from what we heard already. But please, just go on, Professor Drechsler.
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. Audience, can I have the slides, please? Well, let me start already. The bias, if you have an appointment in Estonia and you talk about local e-governance today, is that people expect kind of a cliche e-hype speech that says that there is no life outside of the digital. And I'm very hesitant to blow into this horn, but there is practically no life that goes without the digital today. Next slide, please. And certainly this is the case about Ukraine. In the beginning of the talks about this lecture, the question was raised, is this really an important agenda point, or where on the development is Ukraine today? And I asked a former student of mine who has become one of the mayors of the new municipalities, and he said, if in a very polite way, how can you even ask such a question, even for confirmation? Of course, life has so much moved into the digital that since 2009, we do not talk about the difference between the real and the virtual anymore, because the virtual has become real. So the question when talking about local e-governance in Ukraine is not whether this is a desirable or possible thing, but it is a necessity in that local governance needs to take the realities of life into account. Next slide, please. What makes our time and the last years, maybe the last decade, important is also that democratization as such is not enough anymore. The big questions that we are all discussing now about democracy in peril and competition to democracy and threats and challenges, what this means is that once you have democracy, once you have transition to democracy, once you're establishing democracy, it is really important to deliver. Now, I would not say that public service provision is all that the state on all levels is about. This is too little, and it's not the entire story, but it is very important. And if you want to cement democracy or develop democracy, the public sector needs to deliver on a very, very high level, because if it doesn't, it strongly delegitimizes what we have achieved or want to achieve. Next slide, please. And the third basic thing I want to say is that whatever one knows about e-governance is probably outdated already, because e-governance is a moving target. And that makes it very difficult for experts, including local governance experts and public administration experts. You see, this is the queen from Alice in Wonderland, and she is running, and Alice asks her, why are you running? And she says, well, here you have to run to stay where you are, and you have to run double as fast to get somewhere. This is certainly the case with digitalization. So it is a highly, highly demanding and very tricky field from this side. Next slide, please. Actually, here I can really go to Mr. Virant and Mr. Steiner about the importance of municipality that we have already heard before. So we do live in municipalities. If we go out of the door, we are in a municipality. States may be imagined communities, but local governments are not. They are real, hopefully at least, and certainly after good reforms. Next slide. And if we want to develop economically and socioeconomically on all levels, this needs to happen on the local level at least as well, for which the municipalities need their tools. Next slide, please. So I agree with what was already said, and that is that municipal autonomy is an extremely high value, and it's an important achievement of civilization that we do know furthers life quality. But there is also the necessity to have some form of coordination, and what is extremely important, what we see with smart cities today, is that, and smart villages as well, they need to be interoperable. That means to create islands alone doesn't really do, and especially in a time where people are moving more than one would think, this is an absolute necessity. But once again, we are forced into a balancing act, which is always more difficult than to have an easy solution the one way or the other. Next slide, please. So in sum, there is no local government without e-government. The question is, how do we establish good e-government on the local level? Not whether or when, but how. Next slide, please. And it is really important that we don't fall prey to the policy bias. That means to establish papers or have commissions with certain theories or something like that, that say it should be in a certain way. The crux in public administration is always in the implementation, and so the key for successful local e-governance, that is certainly something we would say today, and we didn't see that clearly 10 years ago, is really that somebody needs to do that and have that capacity, and that is the people who actually do the local level administration. Next slide, please. In public administration theory, when we are talking again about good public administration, which means equity and performance, there was a time when we thought it's enough to have good institutions. That's not the case. There was a time when we thought that we just have motivated and competent people. That's also not the case. As it looks today, the general opinion is that we need both. That means we need good systems that work in context, not overall reified systems that claim to universality. There are very few universal laws in local governance as well as in public administration. But in context, you need systems that work and deliver. We've heard about those. And we need people who do this well and with good intentions. That is a tough bill, but there is no substitute to that. Next slide, please. This year marks the 100th death of perhaps the most important of the European public administration theorists, Max Weber, who has emphasized a very stable, very classical bureaucracy, which then in reforms in the 80s, 90s, and the early aughts was challenged by a more managerial, more business-oriented approach. The thing, though, is that what we would now say generally as well as for e-governance is what is needed on the administrative level, general as well as local, is agile stability. That means, according to the challenges of the moment, the public sector needs to deliver both sustained stability and agile fixing and going towards the problems that emerge. Again, something here that I'm taking up, if in a bit synthetic way, from the previous papers. And here I have to mention the COVID situation again. One of the big questions that public administration right now is asking itself is what kind of administrative systems have been best in the COVID response? And one of the answers, and I believe correctly, is that those who provide both, that means agile stability, that means with groups or units or people or institutions that react towards a changing environment very quickly and swiftly, plus with high capacity background that can get through such systems. These are the winners. If you have only agility and if you have only stability, you may die quicker. So next slide. The fact is that there are no examples for successful e-governance implementation without high administrative capacity. And since we do need this, the high administrative capacity, however defined, however realized, is something that we need to go for. The investment in this kind of high quality PA on the personal level as well as on the institutional one, on the local level as well, seems absolutely crucial. And that almost is what I want to say, but I have two warnings. Next slide, please. If systems do not man up, to use this old word, and provide high quality digital provisions, then the danger is always that e-governance can used in a packaged way for a negative side. E-governance by far is not only positive at all. There is a Chinese Safe City initiative in which you can purchase a full package of surveillance hardware, software, and even the people. This you have on the corporate sector as well. In other words, if the public sector leaves a competence and contents void in this area, other institutions, agencies, countries, and states will move in. That vacuum will not hold. And next slide. One of the recognitions we have seen in the last decade is that you do need to create the motivated, competent, motivated, competent civil service, because digitalization doesn't lead to an increase either in democracy or in competence. So the phrase here is e-governance is like MSG. This is this powder that you sometimes get in Asian food that increases certain flavors. And that, unfortunately, is what e-governance does. You don't get more democracy by throwing laptops at innocent people. But once you have a very liberal democratic system, e-governance will increase these vectors. And if it is a more oppressive regime, that will also be the case. So in sum, digitalization, as necessary as it is, isn't enough. Next slide. So the goal, as also you lead and GIZ, for instance, in general say, is, at least in peace times, the sustainable quality of life. And I think this is a very good place, the good life in the good city, if you will, as something that we are heading to. But in 2020, this includes truly good local e-governance, aware of the risks. And yes, there are options outside of this, but that doesn't seem to be an option that is being chosen in almost all places in Europe and also not in Ukraine. So truly good local e-governance as a basis for good local governance seems to be needed. Next slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really efficient and interesting, and a lot of little things you mentioned. I mean, little comments that we would all like to start discussing right away now, I think, but we cannot. I think it's polite to first give the word to the last lady, the last person, and the first lady in the room. I'm sorry, Natalia, for this, but we thought that actually your topic about this division of responsibilities and rules and conflicts between levels of government will be the most important for thinking about the future at the end of this workshop. It was touched upon already. We also received a question in the chat about what are the key conditions for well-organized multi-level governance in a big country like Ukraine is. So please, I would invite you to present your presentation, and then hopefully we'll have some time also to your final comments from every one of you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I would like my presentation to be on the screen. We often think about questions or issues or matters as something that belongs to the competencies of central government authorities or local governments. And in my presentation, I will show that there are numerous issues, in particular the issues related to regional development. They lie somewhere in between the competencies, powers and resources of central governments as well as hromadas or municipalities. Moreover, they lie somewhere between the interests of the country, region, area and a local community. And the second point that I would like to illustrate is that for such matters that lie in between various interests and powers, the monopoly to choose which of these issues are to be resolved or not still lies with the central authorities. As yet. Next slide, please. If we take a look at the strategy of the regional development, the state strategy of regional development, it becomes evident that all of the issues that can be resolved at a certain level, like access to different services, are mentioned, but the resources will not be enough for a local community to build adequate level of education, and the central authorities will not be able to resolve this question. The same goes for the development of economy, because the economy is really conditioned by history, by what was going on, for instance, in our territory during the Soviet regime, and nothing can be done at just a single level. So the question is for both financial resources and administrative resources, and it's a question to a lot of problems that cannot be limited with just administrative territory division. The illustrations of questions that we were able to see when together with GIZ we were making a strategical assessment for regional development, it was something that related to the school networking, the strategy of education, which was written for schools to obtain greater budgeting and have a high level. Some of these schools have to be abolished, other schools have to be merged, and here we are confronted with the fact that it's beneficial for everyone. But when we speak about the local village, which needs to close its school, on the one hand it looks beneficial and profitable, but on the other hand, politically speaking, it's very difficult to do because people still work in the school, they have jobs, and salaries are very low in the villages, etc. The same goes for healthcare facilities. There are huge scandals. How can you close a new hospital, for instance? The same goes for roads, because via the territory of a local community, there may be going a road of central significance. And if these local communities can fix themselves these roads, unfortunately the level of road repair may be very low, and therefore it's not something that local communities are responsible for. Talking about land allocation, because of the low process of the market implementation in Ukraine, there are very few authorities with local communities right now. Talking about taxation, sometimes, enterprises are registered in one administrative unit, but they pay taxes and function in another. territorial unit, and there are numerous examples of that, and I will also be providing some specific examples of what it looks like at the level of communities. Next slide. We'll start with school network optimization. The biggest problem it faces with is that it's not happening, but it's because it's not profitable to close the schools for those that have to close it, because the authority to close or set up a school is something that lies with the local community for them to ensure the quality of educational services. If we take Ivankivska amalgamated community, Ivankivska Hromada, there, the community decided which schools to open, which ones to close, and 3 villages were dissatisfied with that. All of the other villages agreed with this plan. They all approved this concept, and they closed the schools. And villagers who had children, they had to send their children to a different Hromada. And thus, they reduced subvention for their own amalgamated territorial community. Another example, it's Mlynkivska Hromada, or municipality. The head of this community decided to merge 2 secondary educational facilities. However, as a result, the villagers disagreed against this, and the regional court at the level of Rayon, they decided that this was wrong to merge these 2 Hromadas into one, and now the budgeting still continues not to be channeled in one way, but it's distributed into several channels. Next is Kalinivska and Ulyanivska Hromadas. It's a very poor area. The local school was closed, and the local children didn't have an educational facility because this community could not provide transportation for these children to go to another school. So eventually the local community began to provide for school buses, but after a while. This is a slightly different example, my favorite one, by the way. It's about Krasnoyilsky village school. It's in the picturesque Transcarpathia. It's a story to show how long these conflicts may run. The impossibility to combine, to mix all of the interests into something one, how long it can run, and how local communities can suffer as a result of that, and they lack proper mechanisms to resolve such serious situations. The school that was built back in 1972, this was still in the days of Gorbachev in power, they decided to run the first reconstruction. It didn't work out. The reconstruction was terminated, money had run out, or whatever was the reason. So without the reconstruction, the school continued to exist for another 20 years. Then they tried to fix and repair something. They changed the floor, and then the money again ran out. In 2008, the flood damaged the school. Yulia Tymoshenko came to see the school. She was the then prime minister, and she promised money for the reconstruction, but the money never arrived. It was very important at that time to speak about that school because it's a large-sized one, and it services several villages that are situated up in the mountains. Sometimes some of the children have to walk as long as 3 hours to reach that school. So Tymoshenko, the prime minister, promised, and she never delivered on her promise. Things stopped until the year 2018, when the school began to fall apart because of these disconnections, disagreements. Mold spread so much that even the floor started to fall in, and the children began to cough and suffocating, and the school had to be closed down, and they transferred them to some empty premises, like the local village council. Then the next government of Groisman allocated some 10 million Ukrainian hryvnias. He went to that place, and now Shmygal, the current prime minister, who was the head of the local regional administration, he went there and he promised the money. The government changed, the money disappeared, and the local community announced a local bid for that, and some construction contractors began to build, but then again they didn't finish the work and disappeared together with the money. At the end of this year, in the month of August, the money again re-emerged because it's the new government. they began to take their personal interest in this reconstruction, but still the local community cannot resolve its own problem because the money budgeted as a result of the tender announced previously, and the contractors had built something wrong. Now they have to be paid money for that to finish their construction, but they will not do much. So this local community is left stranded. All of these are the illustrations, as well as the previous illustrations. They are there to show that local communities have their authorities in place, but these large-scale problems still cannot be tackled because there is no one effective mechanism of how to raise these issues if they are complicated and complex. They don't have realistic ways of tackling, and perhaps it will take years and years, and maybe never, for them to be able to resolve such matters. Next slide, please. Roads. The same goes for roads. And this program, the Great Construction, which is running across Ukraine, is trying to resolve these problems in many ways, but Mezhivska territorial community, which is pretty well off, they're ready to allocate money for road infrastructure themselves in order to fix the central significance road, because they have more than 20,000 people in this community that have been deprived of means to the centers of administrative service provision or to local hospital, because unfortunately the road went into complete disrepair because of the military campaign hostilities in the eastern of Ukraine. So this territorial community is a success story because they achieved success. Eventually this road was built. Next slide. Talking about land, once again, it's very similar because recently in the Parliament of Ukraine, they voted in favor of a law in favor of decentralization and power for local communities to be able to deal with their land, which is of not agrarian purpose. And there are lots of lawsuits running right now across the country because of the land issues, because local citizens quite often do not want to lease their land. They mistrust leasers because the prices charged are very unfair, and there are lots of numerous protests rolling across the country. And all of the previous illustrations that I have provided, they are pretty convincing to show that irrespective of how much we can delineate between different delegated authorities on paper, still, if we do not get all of the stakeholders involved, it's impossible to resolve any matters or problems. Therefore, besides these problems, if they go beyond the limits of a certain geographical territory, if they're so significant and something that cannot be resolved at the local self-government, still there are no mechanisms for these matters to be handled. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Natalia. We have exactly 10 minutes left. So what I would like to happen is for each of the speakers to have one final message. You can talk, to the people, or you can comment on something other speakers have said. I know, for example, Mr. Virant was also champion of digital government in Slovenia, and there were a lot of interlinkages between your presentations. I will not ask questions, but I will just ask who wants to start. Just raise your hand, because I see all. Nobody wants to start. Yes, Mr. Virant, please.
Yeah, thank you. I will be very brief. My conclusion, after all that I have heard today, is that after all the achievements that the decentralization reform has achieved in Ukraine, especially in terms of merging the municipalities, the biggest questions lay ahead. The biggest question still needs to be answered, especially the question of how multi-level governance will be organized in Ukraine and how responsibilities and competencies and power and money will be distributed among different levels of governance, and also how the state, the central government, will organize its function across the territory of the country. Given the size of the country, how huge Ukraine is, and also how great it is as a country, I think this is a massive challenge. It will all have to be considered and implemented very carefully, because every mistake in this respect, every small mistake will be magnified, and the impacts, the negative impacts might be really massive. So it is time to start really thinking about these issues at the level of policymakers.
Thank you, Gregor. Yes, Professor Steiner, please.
My impression from what I have heard this afternoon is that we need municipalities which have the support from their citizens. And this means we need municipalities where the people can really decide on what the municipality does and how the services are being provided on one side. And on the other side, we need municipalities who really perform, who deliver the services the people need. In order to get a good approval, we really need municipalities who have power. And this means we need city councillors, we need bureaucrats who really know how to manage a municipality. And this is not self-evident. This needs support from the central government. This needs a good training, education of all these bureaucrats. And this also needs a support in introducing new technologies. We cannot leave the municipalities alone. We have to really strengthen them and to give them power. Financial power, resource power, but also managerial power. And I think this is the big challenge now, to really feel this concept of municipality in the future in the Ukraine. I think this is possible, but this takes a long way to go. And citizens may easily be disappointed from what the municipalities deliver. And so we should have the possibility to really show results, easy wins, that the citizens see, yes, there is a progress going on. And I think this is something which has to be supported by all tiers of government, which has to be supported also by experts and by the entire civil society. It takes a long breath, but it's possible.
Thank you. To add to your optimism, it was said today in an earlier session that there is some evidence that people are now paying more taxes or more voluntary paying taxes because of the new Hromadas, and they are a little bit positive towards this new development, but it really needs a lot of support to make it happen. So maybe, I see no hands, but maybe I can ask Mr. Drechsler, yes, please.
Yes. So I think that municipal unit reform is a very heavy act in today's structured living together, as is decentralization. I absolutely agree that once you do that, the challenges lie ahead, but the responsibility is also very high to make this work. This is difficult and arduous and very expensive, but I don't really see how one could conceptualize an alternative to it. And it's not only a responsibility, but to be a bit positive as well, it is also a positive challenge and an opportunity to do this well. My ideal of the formatted public sector is the entrepreneurial state, and that includes entrepreneurial municipalities that really advance and foster and push forward citizen engagement and the good life in the good city. That can be done, and it is worth every stakeholder's great effort in doing so. Thanks.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And there was in the morning in the chat, somebody commented that municipalities need these little victories and they need to communicate them well. We'll hear in the afternoon about how you tell a story about your success, but exactly, this is then a bit entrepreneurial, to make something good for your small but important for your people at your local level and have these victories. Mr. Tymoshchuk, were you thinking when you were listening to all these ideas that, how will the municipalities do it? Do they have enough people? Do they have enough resources, skills, support from the central level? Or were we thinking, yes, this is great, now we know how to do it?
You don't know exactly, I don't know exactly how, but I'm definitely confident that what Ukraine has been able to perform during the last 5 years is a really rigorous reform, creating territorial communities and these new regional setup. And all of those examples that have been demonstrated to us, they bear witness to the fact that people are happy with the powers delegated to that, even with those limited resources that they have. Talking about the people resources, human resources, is definitely one of the most painful ones, because good personnel is definitely lacking. And even if we look at the ratio in Ukraine, a lot of public officials are still there at the central level. There are 2 or 3 times as many as at the local level, and a lot of powers are being delegated on the regional or local level. But the proportions in terms of personnel, unfortunately, are still not changing in favor of local regions. And the Ministry of Local Development, Regional Development, profile committees are really taking it very close to their heart, talking about the further development in the regions. But other ministries are still holding fast to their budgets, resources, structures, and they do not feel the general context of the changes taking place in the country. So there's this homogeneous unity in terms of how change should be rolling across the country. It's not only units that have to be set up, but the efforts have to be redistributed. In terms of digitalization in Ukraine, Ukraine is probably unique in many ways, because the industrialization context, there are some very successful stories. In some places like Ivano-Frankivsk, Kremenchuk and Kharkiv, these are 1 million strong cities, some of them. E-governance is developing there at a very high level. And in this connection, I'd like to say that we have to find a model of digitalization for the country to be implemented both by the central authorities as well as supported at the local level. Therefore, there has to be this communication, connection, and mix of the efforts, and the central authorities have to hear the voices of local, regional authorities. And
Thank you very much. As at home, the last word in this session will go to the lady. Natalia, how can we, or how can you avoid such conflicts better that you spoke about in future?
Thank you. Yes, I will voice my conclusions. Many questions of regional development still lie in between the authorities of local and central authorities, and between the interests of businesses, communities, regions, villages. And in order to balance all of these interests and authorities and mandates, it takes communication, negotiations, creating platforms upon which the interests of local communities or municipalities will be presented in order to be resolved effectively. And another conclusion I have made from the presentations delivered by my colleagues concerning digitalization, my conclusion is that it's really necessary to keep our eyes open with regard to new technologies that incessantly open up and emerge in order to avoid different approaches to resolving the same problems within our country. Like we have a smartphone state, or is one approach, and another building administrative centers of providing services as another solution. So we shouldn't duplicate the same work and the same efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really need to go now. We need to clear the room to be prepared for the next session. The cleaners will come and other people. So thank you everyone for your contributions, for listening, for chatting, and see you at the next session. Goodbye.